The copper tang of blood is a taste you never quite forget, especially when it's mixed with a $50 vintage of Napa Valley Cabernet. It was Easter Sunday, a day meant for resurrection and grace, but as I sat at the head of my hand-carved mahogany dining table, I felt only the cold, sharp reality of betrayal. I am Arthur Sterling. I am 74 years old, and for 4 decades, I sat in wood-paneled boardrooms as the lead investigator for a global risk mitigation firm. I didn't just find out where the money went, I found out why people stole it. I spent my life reading the fine print in contracts and the hidden flickers in a man's eyes. But looking across the table at my only son, Julian, I realized I'd missed the most glaring red flag in my own home. The glass had shattered perfectly. It was a heavy, leaded crystal tumbler, one of a set my late wife Eleanor and I had bought in London 40 years ago. My daughter-in-law, Sloane, had hurled it with the kind of practiced vitriol usually reserved for a Shakespearean villain. It caught me right on the prominence of my cheekbone, the jagged rim carving a 3-inch canyon into my skin before bouncing onto the Persian rug. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of my blood hitting the white linen tablecloth. "You're being a selfish, senile old man, Arthur," Sloane hissed, her voice trembling not with regret, but with the sheer adrenaline of her own entitlement. She stood there, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her silk dress stained with the wine she'd just weaponized. Beside her, Julian sat frozen. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't grab a napkin to staunch the wound. He just stared at his plate, his hands shaking, a pathetic portrait of a man who had sold his soul to a woman who didn't even respect him. I didn't scream. I didn't even wince. I simply reached up, touched the warmth spreading down my face, and looked at my fingers. They were stained a deep, visceral crimson. I looked at Sloane, then at her parents Thatcher and Vivian Beaumont, who sat at the other end of the table. The Beaumonts were old money whose accounts had run dry 2 decades ago, though they still dressed like they owned the New York Yacht Club. Thatcher was busy adjusting his silk tie, his eyes darting toward the hallway, already mentally measuring where his antique armoire would fit. "The house, Dad," Julian finally stammered, his voice thin and reeking of desperation. "We're not asking, we're telling you, you're not fit to live here alone anymore. This estate, the Sterling name, it needs stewards. People who can actually maintain the legacy." I let a small, grim smile touch my lips, which only made the cut on my cheek sting with a fresh fire. "Legacy," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. You wouldn't know the meaning of the word if it hit you in the face, but then again Sloane just took care of that part, didn't she? What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this moment wasn't an ending. It was a catalyst. I had been waiting for this. Not the violence perhaps, but the revelation. For 6 months, I had watched the shadows lengthening in my own family. I had seen the redirected mail, the whispered phone calls in the library, the way Sloane looked at my ancestral portraits as if they were price tags waiting to be cashed in. I was a man who specialized in phase 1 of any investigation, the baiting of the trap. 10 minutes later, after they'd retreated to the parlor to let me think about my options, I was in the small, discreet bathroom off the foyer. I wasn't cleaning the wound to hide it. I was cleaning it to document it. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, not the one Julian knew about, but the encrypted line I kept for my private consultations. I snapped 3 high-resolution photos of the gash. The lighting was perfect, the blood looked vivid, the intent undeniable. Then, I opened a hidden app on the device. My house, a sprawling 1920s manor in the heart of Watch Hill, Rhode Island, was more than just a relic. It was a fortress of information. I scrolled through the live feeds from the pinhole cameras I'd had installed in the crown molding of the dining room, the study, and even the master suite. I hit save on the last 30 minutes of footage. I watched the replay on the small screen, Sloane's face contorting, the glass flying, Julian's silent complicity, and Thatcher Beaumont whispering to his wife, "Once he's in the facility, we'll sell the silver first." I felt a coldness settle over me that had nothing to do with the blood loss. It was the clarity of a man who finally knows who his enemies are. I messaged my old friend and lead counsel, Elias Thorne. "The eagle has landed, Elias. It's worse than the spreadsheet suggested. They didn't just want the trust, they wanted blood. I have it all on the cloud. Start the proceedings." Elias replied within seconds, "Are you safe? I can have the state police there in 20 minutes. "No," I typed back, watching through the foyer camera as Sloane began to pace the living room, her eyes landing on my safe behind the portrait of my great-grandfather. Let them get comfortable. Let them believe the senile old man is broken. I want them to move in. I want them to start spending the money they think they have. I want the fall to be from a much higher altitude. I walked back out into the foyer, holding a bloody towel to my face, playing the part of the dazed victim. Julian looked up, his expression a mix of guilt and greed, a cocktail I'd seen on 1,000 white-collar criminals over the years. "Dad," he said, standing up. "Look, we're sorry it got heated, but you have to see reason. The Beaumonts have lost their estate in Virginia. Sloan and we're in a bit of a cash crunch with the new venture. It just makes sense. We move in, we take over the bills, and you get to retire in peace at the Willows. It's a top-tier facility, Arthur. Only the best for you." The Willows. I knew the place. It was a gilded cage for the elderly, a place where people were sent to be forgotten while their heirs picked their bones clean. The Willows, I repeated, my voice feigning a slight tremor. "Is that what Sloan wants?" Sloan stepped forward, her eyes bright with a predatory light. "It's what's necessary, Arthur. You're a danger to yourself. Look at you bleeding, confused. If the authorities saw you like this, they'd commit you in a heartbeat. We're trying to keep it in the family." I looked at her. Really looked at her. She was the daughter of a failing dynasty, a woman who had married my son because she thought the Sterling vault was bottomless. She didn't realize that I had spent the last 40 years making sure that vault was only accessible to those with honor. "Give me until Wednesday," I said, sinking into a velvet armchair, looking every bit the defeated patriarch. I need to say goodbye to the house. To Eleanor's things." Thatcher Beaumont let out a long, relieved sigh and poured himself a generous glass of my 20-year-old scotch. "Of course, Arthur, we aren't monsters. Wednesday it is. We'll bring the paperwork over then." They didn't see the way my hand gripped the arm of the chair. They didn't see the way I glanced at the silver-tipped pen in my breast pocket, the one that was currently recording every word of their mercy. I drove myself to the emergency room that night. The triage nurse gasped when she saw me. An elderly gentleman in a bespoke suit, drenching a silk towel in blood. I told her I'd tripped and fallen against the sideboard. I gave her a story that was a masterpiece of elderly confusion. She looked at me with such pity, her eyes watering as she called for a doctor. "Sir, do you have someone to call?" she asked gently. "No," I whispered, looking at the floor. "My son is very busy. I don't want to be a burden." She squeezed my hand, her heart breaking for the poor, lonely old man. Behind my eyes, I was cataloging the interaction. That nurse would be a star witness. Her medical notes would state that Arthur Sterling arrived alone, neglected by his family, covered in his own blood. By the time I left the hospital with 12 stitches and a prescription for pain that I wouldn't take, the plan was already in motion. Elias had already begun the deep dive audit of Julian's venture capital firm. We already knew about the offshore accounts Sloan was using to funnel money to her parents' failing horse farm. We knew about the gambling debts Julian had hidden in a shell company named after my late wife. As I pulled my car back into the long, winding driveway of the Sterling estate, I saw the lights on in the upstairs windows. They were already there. They hadn't even waited for Wednesday. I could see the silhouette of Vivian Beaumont in the master bedroom, my bedroom. She was likely going through Eleanor's jewelry box as we spoke. I parked the car and sat in the dark for a long moment, watching my house, the house I had built with sweat and integrity, being occupied by a pack of wolves. I touched the bandage on my face. The pain was a cold, sharp reminder of what was at stake. I didn't know it yet, but the trap I was setting wasn't just for the house. It was for their entire future. I had been a corporate risk consultant for a long time, and I knew one rule above all else. A thief will always return to the scene of the crime if they think there's more to steal, and I was about to make them think I was the biggest score of their lives. I opened the front door and heard the sounds of laughter coming from the kitchen, my kitchen, along with the clinking of my grandmother's silver. They were celebrating their victory. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was a senile old man who was one step away from a nursing home. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just Arthur Sterling, the retired father. I was the man who had brought down CEOs and dismantled cartels, and I was just getting started. The morning light in Watch Hill usually felt like a benediction, a golden warmth spilling over the Atlantic and into the tall, arched windows of the Sterling estate. But that Monday morning, the light felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. I woke up on the small sofa in my private study. My cheek throbbed with a rhythmic, hot intensity that synchronized with my heartbeat. Every time I blinked, the stitches pulled at the corner of my eye. a constant physical reminder that the woman in my kitchen had tried to break my face with a piece of my own history. I didn't go to the master suite to change, I didn't have to. Through the small monitor hidden behind a dummy row of leather-bound law books on my shelf, I watched the live feed of my own bedroom. Vivian Beaumont was sitting at Eleanor's vanity. She was wearing Eleanor's silk robe, the one I still kept folded in lavender, and she was applying lipstick with the casual indifference of a conqueror. She picked up a silver hairbrush, a wedding gift from my parents, and began to pull it through her thinning, bleached hair. I felt a surge of cold, precise fury, the kind that makes your hands go perfectly still. In my line of work, you learn that anger is a luxury. If you're angry, you're distracted. If you're distracted, you're dead. I took a deep breath, centered myself, and began to record. This was all data. Every brushstroke, every stolen garment, every glass of my juice they poured, it was all evidence of a hostile takeover. I'd spent my career investigating men who thought they were too big to fail and families who thought their names were shields. I knew the Beaumonts type. They were the grandiose desperates. They had the manners of the elite, but the ethics of a cornered stray. Thatcher Beaumont had lost the family's textile fortune in the 90s through a series of disastrous speculative bets in South America, a fact he'd buried under layers of social club memberships and rented luxury cars. Vivienne was a social climber who had climbed a ladder that was currently rotting from the bottom up, and then there was Sloane. She was their masterwork. They had raised her to be a weapon, trained to find a man with a legacy and a blind spot. She had found that blind spot in Julian. My son was a good man, or at least he had started as one. He had Eleanor's soft heart and my drive, but he lacked the internal compass to navigate a woman like Sloane. He wanted to be a titan like me, but he wanted the shortcuts. I remembered the day he brought her home 5 years ago. We were sitting on the terrace, and she had spent the entire afternoon asking about the provenance of my art collection. Not the beauty of the pieces, mind you, but the provenance. She wanted to know the value. She wanted to know the chain of custody. I had told Eleanor that night that the girl didn't have a soul. She had a ledger. Eleanor, always the optimist, had told me I was being too cynical. "He's happy, Arthur," she'd said, touching my hand. "Let him be happy." I should have listened to my gut. But Eleanor was dying, and I wanted Julian to have someone by his side when she was gone. I let the wolf into the fold because I was too busy mourning the shepherd. A sharp knock on the study door broke my reverie. I didn't move. I waited for the second knock, then the third, playing the part of the confused, sleeping old man. When the door finally swung open, it wasn't Julian, it was Thatcher Beaumont. He was wearing one of my cashmere cardigans. It was too big for him, hanging off his narrow shoulders like a shroud. "Arthur, you in here?" "You in here?" he asked, his voice booming with a false, jovial heartiness. I rubbed my eyes and sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall. I made sure to let him see the dark, ugly bruising around the stitches on my cheek. I wanted him to see the damage. I wanted him to feel the weight of what his daughter had done, though I knew he was likely incapable of empathy. "Thatcher," I croaked, making my voice sound brittle. What time is it?" "Nearly 10, old boy. You gave us quite a scare. The wine, the fall. Sloane was inconsolable last night. She feels terrible that her clumsiness caused such a mess." Clumsiness. That was the narrative now. Not an assault, but an accident. A misunderstanding between a tired daughter-in-law and a fading patriarch. "I'm sure she does," I murmured. "Where is Julian?" "He's in the library. Busy. You know how it is. The markets are volatile. He's trying to stabilize some things for the Beaumont-Sterling merger." There it was, the merger. It was the term they used to describe the systematic draining of my accounts to cover their debts. I knew for a fact that Julian's venture capital firm, Sterling Apex, was currently under a silent audit by the SEC. I knew it because I was the one who had triggered it 4 months ago through an anonymous whistleblower tip. I had to know if my son was just a fool or a criminal. The audit had revealed the truth. Julian had been borrowing from his clients' escrow accounts to fund Sloane's lifestyle and Thatcher's debts. He was $3.2 million in the hole. He wasn't just in a cash crunch. He was looking at federal prison, and the only thing standing between him and a jumpsuit was the Sterling family trust. "I should go see him," I said, standing up with a deliberate stumble. Thatcher reached out to steady me, his grip on my arm uncomfortably tight. It wasn't the grip of a friend. It was the grip of a jailer. "He's quite stressed, Arthur. Why don't you let Vivienne bring you some tea in the sunroom first? We've taken the liberty of moving some of your things out of the master suite. We thought you'd be more comfortable down here, closer to the kitchen. Less stairs for those old knees, eh?" They had moved me. In my own house. They had demoted me from the master of the estate to a guest in the servants' quarters. You moved Eleanor's things? I asked, my voice rising with a rehearsed tremor of panic. Now, everything is safe. We've put them in the attic for the time being. To make room for the new life of the house. I followed him into the hallway. The house smelled different. It usually smelled of beeswax and old books and the faint scent of Eleanor's jasmine perfume. Now, it smelled of Sloane's heavy, expensive floral scent and Thatcher's cigar smoke. I walked past the portraits of my ancestors, and I felt their eyes on me. Is this it, Arthur? They seemed to ask. Is this how the sterling name ends? In a whimper of compliance, I reached the library and pushed open the heavy oak doors. Julian was sitting behind my desk, the one where I had signed the papers that built my empire. He looked up, and for a split second, I saw a flash of the boy I used to know, the boy who used to hide behind that very desk when he was afraid of the dark. But the moment passed, replaced by a hard, glassy stare. Sloane was standing by the window, her arms crossed. She didn't even look at me. She was staring out at the ocean, her profile sharp and hungry. Dad, Julian said, standing up. Glad you're awake. We've had a long talk with the family. Given what happened last night, your episode, we've decided that Wednesday is too far away. I sank into the leather chair across from him. What does that mean, Julian? It means we have the papers here now, Sloane said, turning around. She held up a thick sheaf of legal documents. It's for your own protection, Arthur. A full power of attorney. It gives Julian and me the authority to manage your medical care and your financial affairs. It includes a voluntary admission to the Willows for a rest and evaluation period. Voluntary, I whispered. It's better this way, Julian said, his voice cracking slightly. If we go through the courts, it gets ugly. We'd have to bring in doctors, testify about your confusion, your outbursts, the accident with the wine. It would be in the papers, Dad. The sterling name would be dragged through the mud. He was threatening me. My own son was using my reputation as a hostage. And if I don't sign? I asked. Sloane took a step forward, the light catching the diamond on her finger, a 5-carat stone Julian had bought with money he didn't have. Then we call the police. We tell them you attacked me last night. We tell them you're delusional and violent. We have Thatcher and Vivian as witnesses. Who do you think they'll believe? A decorated veteran and a pillar of the community like Thatcher, or a 74-year-old man with a documented history of episodes? I looked at the papers on the desk. They were meticulously drafted. I recognized the firm, Blackwood and Associates. They were the kind of lawyers who specialized in making the illegal look inevitable. I need to read them, I said, reaching for my glasses. No, Sloane snapped. You've read enough files in your life, Arthur. This is a family matter. Just sign the last page. Julian is already listed as the primary, and I'm the secondary. It's all very standard. I looked at Julian. Is this what you want, son, to put me away? Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. I want you to be safe, Dad. I want the estate to be safe. I picked up the pen, the silver pen that was currently broadcasting this entire conversation to Elias Thorne's secure server. I held it over the signature line. I could feel the three of them leaning in, their breath held, their greed practically vibrating in the air. They thought they were seconds away from the finish line, but I hadn't spent 40 years in risk mitigation to be taken down by a group of amateurs. I had already seen something they'd missed. On the desk, tucked under the power of attorney papers, was a second document, a letter of intent for the sale of the Sterling estate. They weren't just taking over, they were already liquidating me. Wait, I said, pulling my hand back. There's a mistake on page 4. Sloane's eyes narrowed. There are no mistakes. I checked it myself. The trust account number, I said, feigning a squint. It's missing a digit. If I sign this and the number is wrong, the bank will flag it for an internal audit. You don't want the bank looking too closely right now, do you, Julian? I saw the color drain from Julian's face. He knew about the audit. He knew how close he was to the edge. I'll have to call the lawyer, Julian stammered. We'll get a corrected copy. Do that, I said, standing up. In the meantime, I'm going to take a walk. I need some air. You're not going anywhere alone, Sloane said, her voice dropping an octave. Thatcher, go with him. I walked out of the library, Thatcher trailing behind me like a mangy shadow. I headed toward the cliffside path that bordered my property. The wind was picking up, the waves crashing against the rocks below with a violent, rhythmic energy. I didn't tell Thatcher that I had a second phone hidden in the hollow of an old oak tree near the gazebo. I didn't tell him that Elias had already frozen the main trust account 2 hours ago under a suspicious activity flag. And I certainly didn't tell him that I had invited a guest of my own to dinner tonight. As we reached the edge of the cliff, Thatcher leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. "You're making this difficult, Arthur. You're an old man. You could have a dizzy spell out here. You could fall. Accidents happen to people who don't cooperate." I looked at the gray, churning water below. "You're right, Thatcher. Accidents do happen. I didn't know it yet, but the biggest accident of your life was thinking I was just an old man." Just then, my watch vibrated a silent alert. My guest had arrived at the gate, but it wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. It was someone Julian hadn't seen in 15 years, someone who knew exactly where the Beaumonts had buried their first set of bodies. What happened next changed everything, because for the first time, I saw the look of genuine, bone-chilling fear on Sloane's face as she watched a black SUV pull into the drive. "Who is that?" she whispered, joining us on the path. I turned to her, the wind whipping my hair, the blood from my stitches finally starting to dry into a hard, dark crust. "That," I said, "is the reason you should have checked the provenance of the Sterling family a little more carefully." The black SUV didn't just crawl up the driveway. It claimed the gravel with the heavy, rhythmic crunch of something armored and inevitable. I watched from the cliffside path, the wind off the Atlantic tugging at my bandage, as the vehicle came to a halt in front of the manor's grand portico. Sloane had frozen beside me, her breath hitching in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She recognized the vehicle. More importantly, she recognized the man who stepped out of the driver's seat, Silas Vane. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite and dressed in a $3,000 suit that couldn't quite hide the predatory slope of his shoulders. Silas was my fixer. For 20 years at the firm, when a paper trail turned into a dead end, I sent Silas. He was the man who spoke the language of the underworld, so the board of directors didn't have to. Seeing him here, on the manicured lawns of Watch Hill, was like seeing a shark in a swimming pool. "Arthur," Thatcher Beaumont barked, his face pale beneath his fading tan. "What is this?" "Who is that man?" "An old associate," I said, my voice finally steady. I realized that if we're going to discuss the merger of our families, we should have someone present who understands the true value of historical debts. Sloane's hand went to her throat. I saw the diamond on her finger tremble. She knew Silas Vane because 10 years ago, when the Beaumont textile empire was crumbling in Virginia, Silas was the one who had quietly repossessed their private jet in the middle of the night. He was the ghost of their greatest failure, and now he was standing on my front porch, holding a matte black briefcase. As we walked back toward the house, I felt the shift in gravity. The senile old man act was a mask I wore to draw them in, but Silas's presence was the first crack in their confidence. "Julian," Sloane called out as we entered the foyer. Her voice had a sharp, hysterical edge. "Julian, come out here." My son emerged from the library, looking harried. When his eyes landed on Silas, he actually took a step back, nearly tripping over the Persian runner. "Vane, what are you doing here?" "My father isn't. He's not doing business anymore." Silas didn't smile. He had a way of looking through people, as if he were calculating the weight of their bones. "Mr. Sterling never stops doing business, Julian. He just changes the venue." Silas turned to me and gave a slight, respectful nod. "The files you requested are ready for review, Arthur, along with the supplementary findings from the Richmond office." Richmond, the Beaumont's home turf. I saw Vivian Beaumont, who had been watching from the top of the stairs, grip the banister so hard her knuckles turned white. "We're having a private family discussion, Mr. Vane," Sloane said, trying to regain her footing. She stepped into Silas's space, her chin tilted up, but she was vibrating with fear. "Arthur is tired. He's going to sign some papers, and then he's going to get some rest. Your services aren't required." I ignored her and walked toward the dining room, the site of last night's bloodshed. The table had been cleaned, the broken glass swept away, but the air still felt thick with the memory of the impact. I took my seat at the head of the table. "Sit down, everyone," I said. It wasn't a request. It was the voice I used when I was about to dismantle a shell company. They sat. Julian sat to my right, looking like a condemned man. Sloane sat beside him, her eyes darting between me and Silas, who remained standing by the sideboard, a silent, looming sentinel. Thatcher and Vivienne took their places at the far end, looking suddenly small in the vastness of the room. "You wanted me to sign a power of attorney," I began, placing my hands flat on the table. You told me I was confused. You told me the sterling name was at risk. It is, Dad, Julian whispered. The audit. I told you. Things are tight. Things aren't tight, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. You're $3.2 million in the hole. You've been skimming from the Harrison Endowment and the Kensington Trust. That's not a cash crunch. That's a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked like he'd been struck. He turned to Sloane, but she was looking at the ceiling. Her jaw clenched. She knew. Of course she knew. She was the one who had spent the $3.2 million on 5-carat diamonds, horse farms, and keeping her parents' failing social status on life support. I didn't know it yet, I continued, looking directly at my son. But the day you married Sloane was the day you decided that my life was an obstacle to your lifestyle. I watched you for 5 years, Julian. I watched you go from a boy who valued the sterling name to a man who was willing to sell it for a line of credit. I leaned back, the pain in my cheek a dull, pulsing reminder of the stakes. I remember when you were 10, you found a wallet in the park with $500 in it. You spent 2 hours looking for the owner because you said, a sterling doesn't keep what isn't his. What happened to that boy, Julian? He grew up, Sloane snapped, slamming her hand on the table. He realized that integrity doesn't pay the property taxes on a place like this. You're sitting on a mountain of gold, Arthur, and you're letting it rot while we struggle. You're 74. What do you need it for? Another 10 years of staring at the ocean? I looked at her. The first time, I felt a flicker of genuine pity. She was so consumed by the hunger for more that she couldn't see she was already starving. I was going to help you, I said, and this was the truth that hurt the most. 6 months ago, I had Elias prepare a bridge loan. I was going to quietly settle your debts, Julian. I was going to give you a chance to come clean, to step away from the Beaumont's influence and find yourself again. Julian's head snapped up. You were? I was, I said. But then I saw the medical reports. I saw the emails between Sloane and a man named Dr. Jax Blackwood, a man who specializes in expedited psychiatric commitments for wealthy heirs. Sloane's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. You've been bugging my computer? She shrieked. I've been protecting my assets. I corrected her. And then came last night. The wine, the glass, the demand. You didn't just want the money, Sloane. You wanted the silence that comes with locking me away. You wanted to erase me so you could play house with my history. I looked at Silas. Silas, would you mind showing our guests the first gift we brought back from Richmond? Silas opened the briefcase and pulled out a single, grainy photograph. He slid it down the long mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Thatcher Beaumont. Thatcher looked at the photo, and his entire body seemed to sag. It was a photo of a shallow excavation in a wooded area behind the old Beaumont mill. There were markers. Forensic markers. What is this? Thatcher wheezed. That, Silas said, his voice like grinding stones, is the reason the Beaumonts left Virginia in such a hurry 20 years ago. It's the reason your head accountant never made it to the bankruptcy hearing. We found him, Thatcher. Or rather, my team found what was left of him. Vivian Beaumont let out a sharp, strangled sob and buried her face in her hands. I didn't know it yet, I said, the open loop of the investigation finally closing. But the Beaumonts didn't just lose their money. They lost their humanity a long time ago. And they brought that rot into my house. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently it felt like the floor was tilting. The Beaumonts were no longer the arrogant elite. They were cornered animals. And Julian, my Julian, was caught in the middle of a war he wasn't equipped to fight. Now, I said, standing up, we're going to discuss the new paperwork. It's not a power of attorney. It's a full confession and a voluntary surrender of all claims to the Sterling estate, and we're going to do it before the sun goes down. You can't do this, Sloane whispered, her eyes wide with a manic flickering light. You're just one man. We have witnesses. We have the episode from last night recorded on our own phones. Do you? I asked, tilting my head. Check your phone, Sloane. Go ahead. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumbs flying across the screen. Her face fell. It's empty. Everything is gone. Silas is very good with digital forensics, I said. Every recording you made, every email you sent, every plan you hatched, it's all on my server now, and it's been wiped from yours. I leaned in, my face inches from hers. The stitches on my cheek were tight, a grim battle scar. You think you're a predator, Sloane, but you're just a scavenger. And you made the mistake of trying to feed on a man who knows exactly how to hunt. Just then, the front door chimes rang again, a deep, heavy sound that echoed through the manor. That will be the first of the moving trucks, I said. The Beaumonts are leaving today. Julian, you have a choice to make. You can go with them, or you can stay and watch as I dismantle everything they've ever touched. But as I looked at Julian, I saw something I hadn't expected. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't remorse. It was a flash of that same cold, glassy hunger I saw in Sloane. You think you've won, Dad? Julian said, his voice suddenly steady. Dangerously so. You think Silas Vane is the only one who knows how to play dirty? You've been so busy watching the Beaumonts that you haven't noticed who's been managing the Sterling Apex accounts for the last month. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. What is that, Julian? I asked, my gut tightening. It's a kill switch, he said, a twisted smile appearing on his face. If I press this, the whistleblower report you sent to the SEC, it gets replaced with a much more interesting file. One that links the Sterling family trust your trust to a series of offshore money lookets and reoperations in the Caymans. Operations that you signed off on 10 years ago, Dad. Or at least, it will look like you did. I stared at my son. The boy who wouldn't keep $500 that wasn't his was now threatening to frame his father for a federal crime. I didn't know it yet, Julian said, mimicking my own tone with a chilling accuracy. But you taught me too well, Arthur. I don't need your permission anymore. I just need you to be quiet. What happened next changed the nature of the game entirely. I had prepared for an external threat, but the betrayal was coming from the very blood I was trying to save. The room felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it, replaced by the heavy, metallic scent of a coming storm. I looked at Julian, my son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders through the surf at Watch Hill, and for the first time, I didn't see a reflection of myself. I saw a stranger wearing my son's face. He held that black remote with the white-knuckled grip of a man who had finally realized that to survive in the world I'd built, he had to become the very monster I'd spent my life hunting. The betrayal wasn't just in the threat, it was in the preparation. To frame me for money laundering through the Cayman Sterling Trust meant he had been digging through my archives for months. He hadn't just been looking for a way to pay his debts. He had been looking for a way to bury his father. You look surprised, Arthur, Sloane said, her voice dropping the hysterical edge and smoothing out into a silk-wrapped blade. She walked over to Julian, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder. Did you really think Julian was just a passive observer? He's a Sterling. He learned from the best. He knew that as long as you were the legendary Arthur Sterling, he would always be the disappointing son. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about sovereignty. I leaned back in my chair, the stitches in my cheek pulling with a dull ache. I looked at Silas Vane. Silas didn't move a muscle, but I saw the way his eyes tracked the remote in Julian's hand. Julian, I said, my voice low and steady, you're holding a detonator. Do you actually understand the payload? If you release those files, you don't just destroy me. You destroy the entire Sterling Foundation. You destroy the very accounts you're trying to seize. You're burning the bank to get to the vault. I'm burning the bank to keep from going to prison, Julian shouted, his composure finally fracturing. You don't get it. The people I owe. They don't care about legacy or integrity. They care about the $3.2 million. If I can't give them your cash, I'll give them your head on a platter. The SEC would love to trade my cooperation for a conviction against the Arthur Sterling. I didn't know it yet, but the man standing before me wasn't just desperate, he was being coached by a master of psychological warfare. Sloane leaned in, her eyes cold and bright. We've already spoken to a contact at the Justice Department, Arthur, a man who owes my father a very old, very deep favor. They're just waiting for the signal. One click, and the FBI is at your door with a warrant that covers the last 30 years of your risk mitigation career. Imagine what they'll find when they start turning over the stones you've hidden. The pressure in the room was palpable. Thatcher Beaumont, sensing the tide had turned back in their favor, regained his bluster. He stood up, smoothing his stolen cardigan. Now, Arthur, let's not be uncivilized, Thatcher said, his voice dripping with false empathy. Julian doesn't want to ruin you. We just want what's fair. You retire to the Willows, you sign over the house and the primary trust, and Julian discovers that the suspicious files were just a clerical error. We all win. I looked at Silas again. This time he gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. The eagle had indeed landed, but the terrain had changed. You think you've thought of everything, Sloane, I said, turning my gaze to her. You've audited my son, you've manipulated your parents, and you've built a cage for an old man, but you forgot one thing about investigators. We never keep our secrets in just one place. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small, worn leather journal. It was Eleanor's. The room went quiet as I laid it on the mahogany surface. Julian, do you know what this is? Julian blinked, his grip on the remote loosening just a fraction. Mom's diary. It's her ledger, I corrected him. Your mother wasn't just the heart of this family. She was the archivist. She knew about the Richmond mill. Thatcher. She knew about the accountant who went missing 20 years ago. And she knew about the Kensington account. Vivian Beaumont let out a sharp, audible gasp. The Kensington account was a private fund Eleanor set up for Julian's future, I continued, my voice gaining strength. A fund that was meant to be unlocked only if Julian proved he had the character to handle it. It contains exactly $4 million. Enough to pay your debts, Julian. Enough to start over. I saw the flicker of pure, unadulterated greed in Sloane's eyes. It was like watching a shark scent blood in the water. Where is it? She demanded, stepping toward the desk. Where is the access code? It's not a code, I said. It's a biometric lock. It requires a sterling signature and a sterling blood sample. But here's the catch. The account is currently tied to a morality clause. If the primary heir is involved in any criminal investigation, or if the account holder that would be me is under duress, the funds are instantly diverted to a blind charity. I looked at the remote in Julian's hand. So, go ahead, Julian. Press the button, frame me, send the FBI. But the second you do, that $4 million, the only thing that can keep the Beaumonts from the street and you from a cell, disappears forever. You'll be a hero to the SEC, and you'll be a pauper in a jumpsuit. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Julian looked from the remote to the journal, his face a battleground of conflicting impulses. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. He was a man drowning, and I had just thrown him a life jacket made of lead. Sloane hissed in his ear. He's lying, Julian. He's bluffing. It's another one of his traps. He doesn't have $4 million hidden away. He's trying to stall. Is he? Silas Vane spoke for the first time, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. I helped Eleanor set up that account, Sloane. I was the one who hand-delivered the biometric scanners to the bank in Zurich. It's real. And it's the only reason you aren't currently being fitted for handcuffs. Sloane spun on Silas. You're his dog. You'll say whatever he tells you to. I'm a man who likes to be paid, Silas said, stepping closer to the table. And Arthur is the only one in this room who still has a liquid balance. You Beaumonts, you're trading on ghosts. Julian's hand was shaking so violently now that the remote was rattling against his palm. Dad, if I sign, if I put the remote down, do I get the Kensington money? My heart broke in that moment. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask how I was. He asked for the payout. The rot wasn't just in his actions. It was in his soul. If you stand down, I said, my voice thick with a disappointment that felt like a physical weight, I will ensure your debts are settled, but there are conditions. What conditions? Sloane snapped. The Beaumonts leave tonight, I said. No luggage, no heirlooms, no silver. They leave with the clothes on their backs. And you, Sloane, you sign a post-nuptial agreement that vacates any claim to the sterling name or estate. You become a guest in this house, nothing more. You live on an allowance I dictate under a roof I own until I decide you've earned the right to breathe my air. It was a humiliating offer. It was a declaration of total surrender. You're insane, Vivian Beaumont whispered from the end of the table. Thatcher, we can't let him do this. Thatcher has no choice, I said, because if he doesn't agree, Silas here is going to call his contacts in Richmond. That shallow grave behind the mill, the one with the forensic markers? The police haven't found it yet, but they will if you're still on my property by midnight. Thatcher looked at his wife, then at the daughter he had raised to be a mercenary. He saw the cold reality. The game was up. He stood up, his face ashen. We'll go, he wheezed. Vivienne, get your coat. No, Sloane shrieked. We aren't leaving. Julian, press the button. Destroy him. Julian looked at Sloane, then at me. For a second, I saw a spark of the old Julian, the one who loved his father. He looked down at the remote, his thumb hovering over the kill switch. I'm sorry, Sloane, Julian whispered. He didn't press the button. He laid the remote on the table and pushed it toward me. I can't do it, he said, his voice breaking. I can't destroy everything. Sloane let out a sound that wasn't human. She lunged for the remote, her nails clawing at the mahogany. but Silas was faster. He caught her wrist in a grip of iron and swept the remote off the table, tucking it into his jacket. "The meeting is adjourned," Silas said, his voice devoid of emotion. I watched as the Beaumonts, Thatcher and Vivienne scurried out of the room like rats fleeing a flooded basement. They didn't even look back at their daughter. They were survivors, and they had just realized that Sloane was no longer an asset. Sloane stood there, panting, her hair disheveled, her eyes fixed on me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You think you've won, Arthur?" she spat. "You think you can keep me in a cage? You think Julian is yours again? You're wrong. You've just turned this house into a war zone, and I have nothing left to lose." I watched her walk out, her heels clicking a sharp, angry rhythm on the hardwood. Julian stayed in his chair, his head in his hands, sobbing quietly. I should have felt triumphant. I had protected the estate. I had cleared the Beaumonts. I had my son back, at least physically. But as I looked at the black remote on the table, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. I picked up the remote and turned it over. I opened the battery compartment. It was empty. There was no kill switch. There was no file. Julian had been bluffing. He had tried to frame me with an empty box. But then, I noticed something else. A small, microscopic piece of tape on the inside of the casing. It was a listening device. A high-frequency transmitter that was still active. I hadn't realized it until that moment, but the Beaumonts weren't the only ones listening. Someone else had been in the room with us the whole time. I looked at Silas. Silas was looking at the remote, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. "Arthur," Silas whispered. "Who else did Julian owe money to?" What happened next changed everything. The front door didn't just chime, it was kicked off its hinges. The sound of the front door splintering was a jagged, violent punctuation to the silence Julian's sobbing had left behind. In my decades of investigating high-stakes fraud, I'd heard the sound of a door being breached many times, usually by a tactical team with a warrant. This wasn't that. This was heavy, rhythmic, and unofficial. It was the sound of a debt coming due in a way that spreadsheets couldn't calculate. Silas Vane didn't even look at the doorway. His eyes remained locked on the remote in his hand, his thumb tracing the microscopic bug hidden inside. He looked at me, a grim, silent communication passing between us. We weren't just dealing with family greed anymore. We were dealing with the consequences of Julian's absolute incompetence. "Arthur," Silas said, his voice dropping into a register of pure tactical readiness, "get behind the desk. Now." I didn't argue. I moved with a speed that belied my 74 years, the stitches in my cheeks screaming as I ducked into the knee-hole of the heavy mahogany desk. Across the room, I saw Julian scramble backward, his face a mask of primal terror. Sloane, who had been halfway to the door to chase after her parents, was thrown back as three men surged into the library. They weren't the sharks I'd expected, not the leather-jacketed thugs of a Miami loan shark. These men wore tactical black, their movements precise, their faces obscured by the shadows of their ball caps. They looked like private security, the kind you hire when you want to disappear someone without leaving a trace. The man in the lead stopped in the center of the room. He didn't point a weapon, he just stood there, radiating the kind of calm authority that only comes from knowing you've already won. He took off his cap, revealing a shock of salt and pepper hair and eyes that looked like they were made of cold, gray sea glass. "Jax Blackwood," Silas said, his voice flat. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. Jax Blackwood, the name I'd seen in the emails, the man who was supposed to be the commitment specialist for the Beaumonts. But looking at him now, I realized he wasn't a doctor. He was a predatory liquidator. "Silas Vane," Jax said, a thin, mirthless smile touching his lips. "I haven't seen you since the Hong Kong merger. I heard you were playing nursemaid to a relic." He glanced toward the desk where I was partially hidden. "Mr. Sterling, I'd tell you it's a pleasure, but we're a bit past the pleasantries, aren't we?" Sloane was the first to find her voice. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide. "Jax, you're early. You weren't supposed to show up until the paperwork was filed. He hasn't signed the power of attorney yet." I closed my eyes for a second. The betrayal wasn't just Julian's. Sloane hadn't just been planning to put me in a home. She had been brokering a deal to sell the entire Sterling estate to a man who made his living by stripping assets from the vulnerable. "The timeline shifted, Sloane," Jack said, not even looking at her. "Your husband's debt to my associates in Miami was sold this morning. I'm the new owner of the Sterling Apex arrears. And since the $3.2 million hasn't materialized, I'm here to take possession of the collateral. He looked around the library, his gaze lingering on the first editions, the ancestral portraits, and the silver-tipped pen still resting on the desk. The house is a start, but we're interested in the Kensington account. Julian let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The remote, the files. I was going to give you the files on my father. The files were a bluff, Julian, Jack said with a sigh of genuine disappointment. We listened to the whole conversation through the bug. Your father is right, you're a pauper in a suit. But your father? Your father is a vault. And I'm a locksmith. Jack stepped toward the desk. Silas Vane moved to intercept him, his posture coiled like a spring. The two men who stood there were mirrors of each other, one who used his skills to protect and one who used them to devour. Step aside, Silas, Jack said softly. Arthur is 74. He's had a traumatic night. He's confused, he's bleeding, and his own son just tried to frame him. In the eyes of the law, he's a man in the middle of a mental health crisis. If he signs the transfer documents now, under my supervision, it'll hold up in any court in the country. Not while I'm breathing, Silas said. That's a temporary condition, Jax replied. One of his men shifted, the holster at his hip visible. I didn't know it yet, but the next 5 minutes would decide whether the Sterling name ended in a bloodbath or a masterclass in strategy. I took a deep breath and stood up from behind the desk. I didn't look at Jax, I looked at my son. Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. Look at me. Julian slowly raised his head. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. This is the world you invited into our home, I said. You thought you were playing a game of leverage. You thought Sloane was your partner. But you were just the key she used to open the front door for a man like Jax Blackwood. Do you see it now? Do you see what happens when you trade your integrity for a line of credit? Julian looked at Jax, then at Sloane, who was standing near the liquidator, already trying to align herself with the new power in the room. The realization finally hit him. He wasn't the sovereign heir. He was the lamb. I didn't know, Julian whispered. I didn't know they were coming for the house today. They were always coming for the house, Julian, I said. The debt was just the excuse. I turned my attention to Jax Blackwood. I let the senile old man mask fall completely. I straightened my back, ignored the throbbing in my cheek, and looked him dead in the eye. I was no longer a victim. I was the lead investigator for Sterling Risk Mitigation. Mr. Blackwood, I said, my voice projecting the cold authority of a man who had stared down warlords. You've made a significant tactical error. You're operating on the assumption that I am a man under duress. You're operating on the assumption that your presence here is a surprise. Jax raised an eyebrow. Is it not? I've had a tracker on my son's car for 6 months, I said. I've had a ghost monitor on Sloane's emails since before the wedding. I knew you were coming. I just didn't know if you'd bring the tactical team or the lawyers first. I reached under the lip of the desk and pressed a small, recessed button. It wasn't an alarm. It was a command. Suddenly, every light in the library began to pulse, not in a frantic way, but in a slow, steady rhythm. The heavy oak shutters on the windows slid shut with a mechanical whir, locking from the outside with steel deadbolts. The library was now a vacuum. The room is shielded, I said. No cell signals, no radio frequencies. The bug in the remote is currently broadcasting nothing but white noise. We are in a closed loop. Jax. Just you, me, Silas, and my disappointing family. Jax's men immediately went for their weapons, but Silas had already cleared his jacket, his own firearm held with a professional's ease. Stay still, Silas commanded. The floor you're standing on is pressure sensitive. If I don't enter a code into my watch every 60 seconds, the fire suppression system activates. It doesn't use water, Jax. It uses halon gas. It'll strip the oxygen from this room in 15 seconds. We'll all go to sleep together. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Jax Blackwood's gray eyes darted around the room, re-evaluating the relic he'd come to rob. You're bluffing, Sloane shrieked, her voice echoing in the enclosed space. He's an old man. He doesn't have the stomach for this. I don't have a stomach for thieves in my wife's robe, Sloane, I said. But I have a very high tolerance for risk. I looked at Jax. You want the Kensington account? Fine. I'll give you the access. But it's not for $4 million. It's for $40 million. That's the real balance. I've been funneling the Sterling profits there for a decade. I saw the flicker of greed in Jax's eyes. It was his only weakness. He was a professional, but he was a predator, and a predator can't walk away from a kill of that size. But here's the catch. I continued. To access a trust of that size, the biometrics have to be verified by a third-party observer, a legal witness of the court. And since we're currently locked in a Halon-ready vault, we have a bit of a problem. What's your proposal, Arthur? Jax asked, his voice cautious. We go to the bank, I said. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. The Sterling and Harrison Private Bank on Main Street. I will sign over the account in the presence of the trustees. In exchange, you give me the original debt notes on Julian's firm and you leave this property. You take Sloane and her parents with you. They're your problem now. Dad, Julian cried out. Be quiet, Julian, I snapped. You wanted to be out from under my thumb? This is how it happens. You belong to Mr. Blackwood now. He can decide what your integrity is worth. Sloane looked horrified. She had spent months trying to get Jax to get rid of me, but she hadn't realized that in Jax's world, she was just another asset to be traded. Jax looked at Silas, then at me. He saw the logic. A forced signature in a basement is a legal nightmare. A voluntary transfer in a private bank is a clean sweep. Fine, Jax said. We stay here tonight. My men will guard the perimeter. At 9 a.m., we go to the bank. If you try to signal anyone, if you try to pull a stunt at the teller window, I won't just kill you, Arthur. I'll burn this house to the ground with your son inside. I expect nothing less, I said. Jax signaled his men to lower their weapons. Silas didn't lower his, but the immediate threat of a shootout vanished. The shutters remained closed, the room a tomb of secrets. Silas, show our guests to the guest wing, I said, my voice weary. And make sure the Beaumonts haven't stolen the towels before they left. As the room cleared, leaving only me and Julian, the silence felt heavier than the Halon gas ever could. Julian looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. You're really giving them the money? He asked. $40 million? You're just giving up? I looked at my son, the boy I had failed by loving too much and trusting too little. I reached out and touched the bandage on my cheek. I didn't know it yet, Julian, I said, my voice a whisper of the man I used to be. But the biggest mistake a locksmith makes is thinking the vault is the only thing with a secret. I walked over to the desk and picked up the silver-tipped pen. I unscrewed the cap. Inside wasn't a recording device, it was a micro-transmitter for a very specific type of silent alarm, one that didn't go to the police. What happened next changed the stakes again, because as I watched the monitor of the guest wing, I saw Sloane whisper something into Jax Blackwood's ear that made him stop and turn toward the camera with a look of pure, murderous revelation. She hadn't just sold the house. She had sold the one thing I hadn't told anyone about the location of Eleanor's other journal, the one that didn't have money in it, the one that had the names of everyone Silas Vane had ever worked for. I realized then that the bank trip wasn't the end of the game, it was the beginning of the massacre. The dawn over Watch Hill was gray and suffocating, the sun struggling to pierce through a thick Atlantic fog that felt like a damp shroud over the estate. I hadn't slept. I spent the night in my study, sitting upright in the leather chair, watching the shadows of Jax Blackwood's men pace the perimeter of my gardens on the security monitors. They moved with a predatory efficiency, their silhouettes cutting through the mist like ghosts of my own past. I looked at the bandage on my cheek and the reflection of the dark monitor. The swelling had gone down, but the stitches felt like a row of hot needles stitched into my pride. I was 74 years old, being held prisoner in the house I had built by a man my son had invited in through the front door. This was rock bottom. Not the blood, not the assault, but the realization that my own flesh and blood, Julian, was currently in the kitchen making coffee for the man who planned to strip us of everything. It's time, Arthur, Silas Vane said, stepping into the study. Silas looked tired. He had stayed awake all night, his hand never straying far from his sidearm, acting as the only barrier between me and Jax Blackwood's hospitality. Silas was more than an associate. He was the last line of defense for a legacy that was currently being liquidated. Is the car ready? I asked, my voice sounding like gravel. Jax is insisting on driving you himself, Silas whispered, leaning in. His men are taking the SUV. Sloane is going with them. She's told him where she thinks the other journal is, Arthur. She's convinced it's in the vault at the bank. I felt a cold prickle of anticipation. Eleanor's second journal. Sloane thought she had found the ultimate leverage, the names of the clients Silas had managed over the years. She thought she was handing Jax a list of high-profile targets to blackmail. She didn't know it yet, but Sloane's greed was the final ingredient I needed for the reversal. We walked into the foyer, where the air was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and cheap desperation. Sloane was standing by the door, wearing a trench coat and sunglasses, looking like she was already auditioning for the role of a billionaire's widow. Julian stood behind her, his eyes red-rimmed, looking like a ghost. "Ready for the big day, Arthur?" Jax Blackwood asked, stepping out of the shadows. He looked refreshed, a sharp contrast to the rest of us. He held a set of keys in his hand, my keys, to my vintage Bentley. "The Bentley, Jax? Really?" I asked, my voice steady. "I like to travel in style when I'm about to inherit $40 million, Jax replied with a smirk. "Silas, you'll ride in the back of the SUV with my men. If Arthur so much as sneezes without my permission, you're the first one they'll deal with. Understand?" Silas didn't answer. He just looked at me, a silent promise in his eyes. The ride to the Sterling and Harrison private bank was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Jax drove with a relaxed, arrogant ease, navigating the winding coastal roads as if he owned the asphalt. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the gray ocean. In the rearview mirror, I could see the black SUV following us closely, a funeral procession for my life's work. "You know, Arthur," Jax said, his voice casual, "I actually respect you. You built quite the fortress here. Most men your age would have folded the second Sloane started whispering about the Willows. But you fought. You baited the trap. You even brought in Silas. And yet," I said, "here I am, sitting in my own car, being escorted to my own bank to give my money to a man I despise." "That's the thing about risk mitigation, isn't it?" Jax chuckled. "Sometimes the risk is internal. You can account for the SEC, for rival firms, for even the Beaumonts, but you can't account for a son who just wants to be daddy's favorite, even if it means killing him." I looked at Jax. "Julian isn't like you, Jax. He's weak, yes. He's foolish. But he's not a predator. He's whatever Sloane tells him to be," Jax shrugged. "And right now, she's telling him that $40 million buys a lot of forgiveness. Speaking of which, Sloane mentioned a journal, the one with the interesting names. She says it's in your private safe deposit box, box 1920. I didn't know it yet, but Jax's curiosity was the exact moment the noose began to tighten. "The box contains Eleanor's personal effects," I said, my voice hardening. "If you touch it, you violate the one thing I still hold sacred." Arthur, Jax sighed, shaking his head. "Sacred doesn't pay the bills. I'm going to take that money and I'm going to take that journal, and then I'm going to decide what to do with you and Silas. Maybe we'll let you stay at the Willows after all. It's a nice view of the woods." I didn't answer. I just watched the speedometer. We were 5 minutes away from the bank. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic beat. Everything relied on the timing. The Sterling and Harrison private bank was a limestone monolith on Main Street, a building designed to radiate stability and old money discretion. As we pulled up to the curb, the manager, a man named Emmett Sterling, my younger brother, was already standing under the awning. He looked at the Bentley, then at the black SUV, and finally at me. He saw the bandage on my face, and I saw the momentary flicker of alarm in his eyes. I gave him a sharp, nearly imperceptible blink. "The signal. Stay close," Jax whispered, gripping my elbow as we exited the car. His men piled out of the SUV, forming a loose perimeter. Silas was flanked by 2 of them, his hands visible and empty. Sloane and Julian followed, Sloane practically vibrating with anticipation. "Arthur," Emmett said, stepping forward, his voice professional but strained. "We weren't expecting you until later this afternoon." "There's been a change in plans, Emmett," I said, my voice projecting a weariness that wasn't entirely faked. "Mr. Blackwood here is a new partner. We're here to finalize the transfer of the Kensington account and access my private box." Emmett glanced at Jax, then at the armed men standing on the sidewalk. "I see. Well, the boardroom is prepared. If you'll follow me." As we walked through the heavy brass doors, the cool, filtered air of the bank hit me. It smelled of ozone and high-end security. I felt the weight of the cameras on us, the real cameras, tied to a system that didn't belong to the house. We were led into the private vault area. It was a high-security zone, accessible only through a biometric gate. Jax's men were stopped at the gate by the bank's own security. "Only the account holders and their legal representatives," the guard said firmly. Jax bristled, but he nodded to his men. "Wait here. If we aren't out in 20 minutes, you know what to do." Sloane, Julian, Jax, and I stepped into the vault room. It was a small, soundproof chamber lined with stainless steel boxes. In the center was a table with a biometric scanner and a digital terminal. "The Kensington account," Jax prompted, gesturing to the terminal. I sat down. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. I began to enter the codes. I felt Sloane leaning over my shoulder, her breath hot on my neck. 40 million, she whispered. "Do it, Arthur. Sign it over and this can all be over." I entered the final sequence. The screen flickered. Identity. Verified. Arthur. Sterling. The screen showed the balance. $40,210,500. Jax's eyes widened. For a man who dealt in liquidations, this was the holy grail. I began the transfer process, routing the funds to a holding account Jax had provided. "Wait," I said, pausing with my finger over the confirm button. "Before I send this, I want to see the debt notes. The ones you bought from Julian's creditors. I want to see them destroyed." Jax reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it on the table. "There they are. Once the transfer clears, I'll burn them right here in front of you." I looked at the notes. Julian's signature was all over them, bold, arrogant, and doomed. I hit confirm. "Transfer in progress." "Now," Sloane said, her voice trembling. "The box." 1,920. The journal. Emmett stepped forward with the master key. He inserted it into the lock of box 1920, and I inserted my own. The door swung open. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. It looked identical to the one I'd shown them at the house. Sloane snatched it before I could touch it. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. "Here," she said, pointing to a list of names and numbers. "These are the offshore contacts. These are the people Silas worked with. Jax, look." Jax took the book, his eyes lighting up. He wasn't just getting the 40 million, he was getting a map to 100 more targets. He looked at me, a triumphant, mocking grin on his face. "You're a dinosaur, Arthur. You thought your integrity was a shield, but it was just a target. Thank you for the donation." But as Jax turned to leave, the vault door didn't open. The heavy, pressurized seal remained locked. "Emmett," Jax barked. "Open the door." Emmett wasn't looking at Jax. He was looking at me. I stood up, the weariness falling away from my face like a discarded mask. "The thing about Eleanor's second journal, Jax," I said, my voice echoing in the small steel room, "is that it was never a list of clients. Eleanor didn't care about my work. She was a woman of science. She was a chemist." Jax looked down at the book in his hand. He noticed, for the first time, a faint, sweet smell coming from the pages. A smell of bitter almonds. "What is this?" Jax asked, his voice suddenly thick. "It's a high-contact neurotoxin," I said. "Absorbed through the skin. Eleanor developed it for a government contract 30 years ago. It's why we kept it in a pressurized, light-controlled vault." Jax tried to drop the book, but his fingers wouldn't obey. His hand was locked in a spasmodic grip. Sloane let out a small, choked gasp and slumped against the wall, her hands, which had touched the book first, already turning a dark, bruised purple. "I didn't know it yet," I said, looking at my daughter-in-law as she slid to the floor. "But the only thing more dangerous than a Sterling's secret is a Sterling's grief." Jax stumbled toward the door, his eyes bulging. The transfer. You sent the money." "I sent the money to the Sterling and Harrison Integrity Fund," I said, "a nonprofit dedicated to prosecuting white-collar criminals." "The account you gave me? It was flagged by the FBI 3 hours ago when you tried to use the Kensington name. They're standing outside the vault right now, Jax, along with the SEC." The vault was silent, save for the heavy, labored breathing of the people who had tried to bury me. Julian was the only one who hadn't touched the book. He sat in the corner, staring at his wife as she gasped for air. "Dad," Julian whispered. "What? What have you done?" I looked at my son, the only thing I had left to lose. "I saved the house, Julian," I said. "But I think I finally realized that the house was never the home. What happens next changed everything, because I had one more surprise for the man standing on the other side of that door." The air in the vault was thick with the scent of bitter almonds and the sound of shallow, desperate breathing. It's a haunting thing to watch a predator realize they've been snared in a trap of their own making. Jax Blackwood, a man who had built an empire on the ruins of other families, was now clutching his throat, his expensive silk tie loosened, his eyes wide and bulging as the neurotoxin took hold. Beside him, Sloane was a crumpled heap of designer fabric and shattered ambition. Her hands, the ones that had so eagerly snatched at what she thought was a map to a hidden fortune, were now a horrifying shade of indigo. I didn't feel the rush of triumph I expected. I only felt a heavy, cold clarity. "The antidote is already in the ventilation system, Jax," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the stainless steel room. "It's a neutralizing agent. You won't die, but you won't be moving for a while. It's a paralytic designed to keep a subject conscious enough to understand the consequences, but immobile enough to prevent further harm." Emmett, my brother, stood by the door, his hand on the emergency release. He looked at me, then at the carnage on the floor. "The federal teams are moving into the lobby, Arthur. Silas has been neutralized on the outside. His guards are currently being zip-tied by the marshals. Julian was the only one left standing besides us. He was pressed into the corner, his back against the safety deposit boxes, his face a pale, sweating mask of terror. He hadn't touched the book. He had been too afraid, too hesitant. His lifelong habit of letting others take the lead had finally saved his physical health, even as it destroyed his soul. "Dad?" Julian whispered, the word trembling. You could have told me. You let me think. You let me go through all of this." I turned to my son. I looked at the boy I had raised, the man who had tried to bury me while I was still breathing. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small, blue ledger. It wasn't a decoy. It wasn't a trap. It was a record of every cent I had spent on him since he turned 21. "I didn't know it yet, Julian," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "But I had already saved you. A month ago, before Sloan even contacted Jax Blackwood, I knew about the Miami debts. I knew about the $3.2 million you owed to the Sharks. And I paid it." Julian's jaw dropped. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a single ragged gasp. You paid it? When?" Anonymously. "Through a shell corporation in Jersey," I said. "I wanted to see what you would do with a clean slate. I wanted to see if, without the weight of the debt crushing you, you would come to me. I wanted to see if you would confess, apologize, or try to rebuild. I gave you the miracle you were praying for, Julian. And you used that miracle to hire a liquidator to put me in a cage. The silence that followed was more devastating than the neurotoxin." Julian's knees buckled. He slid down the wall, his head falling into his hands. He hadn't been fighting for survival for the last week. He had been fighting for greed. He had been trying to steal a fortune he didn't even need to stay alive. He had betrayed me for the sheer, ugly thrill of the take. The vault doors hissed open, the pressurized seal breaking with a sound like a final breath. A team of FBI agents, led by a man I recognized from my days in the field, Special Agent Miller, streamed in. They didn't come with guns drawn. They came with medical kits and evidence bags. "Arthur," Miller said, nodding to me, "we've got the Beaumonts in custody at the border. They were trying to cross into Canada in a rental car filled with your silver." "Check their pockets, Miller," I said, gesturing to Sloan and Jax. "And be careful with the journal. It's evidence of a biological weapon deployment, though I'll be taking full responsibility for that as a defensive measure under duress." I watched as they lifted Sloan onto a gurney. She was awake, her eyes darting frantically, unable to move a muscle as they strapped her down. She looked at me, and in that moment, the hatred was still there, a cold, poisonous fire. She hadn't learned a thing. To her, this wasn't a moral failure. It was just a bad investment. Jax was being treated nearby. Miller leaned over him. "Jax Blackwood, you've been on our radar for the commitment scams for 3 years. We just needed a witness with enough clout to make the charges stick. I think a retired lead investigator for Sterling Risk Mitigation will do nicely." As they wheeled them out, Silas Vane stepped into the vault. He had a small cut on his lip and his suit was dusty, but his eyes were sharp. He walked over to me and handed me the silver-tipped pen. "The recording is complete, Arthur," Silas said. "Every word from the house, the car, and the vault. It's already on the SEC's main server. Julian's firm, Sterling Apex, is being shuttered as we speak. The escrow accounts are being frozen for restitution." Julian looked up at the mention of his firm. "Restitution? But the debt was paid. You said you paid it, Dad." "I paid the loan sharks, Julian," I said, looking down at him. "But I didn't pay the clients you robbed. The $4 million in the Kensington account? It's not yours." "It never was. I've directed the trustees to use every cent of it to pay back the endowments and the pensions you skimmed from. You'll be going to prison, son. Not for the debt, but for the theft." Julian began to sob, not the quiet, refined sob of a man in mourning, but the loud, ugly wail of a child who had finally realized the world didn't revolve around him. An hour later, I was back in the Bentley. Silas was driving this time. We moved through the fog of Watch Hill, the grand estates looking like crumbling monuments in the mist. When we pulled up to the Sterling Manor, the police tape was already being removed. The moving trucks I'd called the ones that were supposed to take the Beaumonts away were still sitting in the drive, empty. I walked into the foyer. The house was cold. The smell of Sloane's perfume still hung in the air, a cloying, suffocating reminder of the infestation. I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing on the wood. I reached the master suite and pushed open the doors. The room was a wreck. Vivian Beaumont had tossed the drawers. Eleanor's jewelry box was empty. The silk robe was crumpled on the floor like a dead thing. I walked over to the vanity and picked up the silver hairbrush. I felt the weight of it in my hand. The cool metal a stark contrast to the heat in my face. I sat on the edge of the bed where I had held Eleanor's hand as she passed. I looked at the empty space beside me. "I protected it, Eleanor," I whispered. "I kept them out, but at what cost?" I didn't know it yet, but the final reversal wasn't about the money or the prison sentences. It was about the one thing I had kept hidden, even from Silas. I stood up and went to the heavy oak wardrobe. I pushed aside the coats and pressed a small recessed panel in the back. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside wasn't a journal, and it wasn't a ledger. It was a single dusty bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. We had bought it for our 50th anniversary, a date Eleanor didn't live to see. I took the bottle and the glasses down to the study. I sat at my desk and looked at the monitors. The house was empty now. The wolves were in cages. My son was in a holding cell. The Beaumonts were being processed. I was alone in 40,000 square feet of history. The phone on my desk rang. It was Elias Thorne. "Arthur," Elias said, his voice grave. "I've just received the final report from the forensic auditors. It's about the Kensington account." "What about it, Elias?" "The restitution is in progress." "It's not about the money, Arthur. It's about the biometrics. When Julian tried to access the vault earlier, the system didn't just record his thumbprint. It ran a full DNA sequence as part of the new legacy protocols you installed." I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. "And?" "Arthur, the sequence didn't match. Not yours, and not the Sterling line. There was a 0% familial match between you and Julian." The world seemed to tilt. I looked at the silver-tipped pen on the desk. I looked at the portrait of my great-grandfather on the wall. "I didn't know it yet," Elias continued, his voice full of a pity I couldn't bear, "but Eleanor had a secret of her own. A secret she buried deeper than any ledger. Julian isn't your son, Arthur. He never was." I sat in the silence of the library, the champagne bottle unopened on the desk. The revenge I had orchestrated, the trap I had set, the son I had broken. He wasn't even mine. The legacy I had spent 40 years protecting was a lie built on a foundation of sand. What happened next changed everything. Because as I stared at the DNA report flickering on my computer screen, I heard a sound from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic clicking of heels. I looked at the monitor. The front door was open, and standing in the foyer, silhouetted against the gray fog, was a woman I hadn't seen in 20 years. A woman who looked exactly like Eleanor. "Hello, Arthur," she said, her voice echoing through the speakers. "I think it's time we talked about the real Sterling heir." I stood in the flickering light of the library, the DNA report on my screen feeling like a death warrant for the last 40 years of my life. The digital readout was cold, binary, and absolute, 0% match. Julian, the man I had raised, the man whose gambling debts I had paid, the man who had just tried to lobotomize my legacy, wasn't mine. He was a cuckoo in the nest, a biological stranger Eleanor had brought home and labeled as our future. I walked toward the foyer, my legs feeling heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. The woman standing there didn't move. She stood near the tall grandfather clock that had ticked through every one of my family's secrets. She wore a simple navy trench coat, her dark hair pulled back, revealing the high, elegant cheekbones of my late wife. But when she looked at me, she didn't have Eleanor's soft, forgiving hazel eyes. She had mine. Cold, piercing, and gray as a winter Atlantic. "Arthur," she said again. Her voice was low, carrying a resonance that vibrated in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. The investigator in me was already connecting the dots. I had been too blind to see for decades. "My name is Cora," she said, stepping into the light. "And unlike Julian, I wasn't a gift to satisfy your ego. I was the secret Eleanor kept to save my life." I leaned against the doorframe, the stitches in my cheek throbbing. I realized then that my perfect life of risk mitigation had been a farce. I had spent 40 years securing the perimeter of a house while the real treasure was miles away, living a life I had never been invited to. Cora walked past me into the library, her eyes taking in the leather-bound books and the high-tech monitors with a look of quiet disdain. She didn't look at the safe. She didn't look at the silver. She looked at a small framed photograph of Eleanor on the corner of the desk, the one taken at our beach house 3 decades ago. She told me everything. "Arthur," Cora said, her back to me. "She told me how you lived in a world of shadows and fixers. She told me about Silas Vane and the men who went missing in Richmond. She loved you, but she was terrified of you. She didn't want me to be a sterling. She didn't want me to be an asset or a legacy. She wanted me to be a person." I found my voice, though it felt thin. "And Julian?" Cora turned, a sad, bitter smile on her face. "Julian was the child of a distant cousin who died in a car accident. He was an orphan. Eleanor saw a chance to give you what you wanted, a son to carry the name, while she sent me to live with her sister in Vermont. She gave you a puppet, Arthur. She figured if the wolves ever came for the sterling heir, they'd find the boy who wanted the life, and not the daughter who deserved the truth." I sank into my chair, the weight of the irony crushing the breath from my lungs. I had spent the last week dismantling Julian's life to protect a bloodline that didn't exist. I had broken a man I thought was my son, only to find out he was a decoy, a human shield Eleanor had placed between my world and her daughter. "Why now?" I whispered. "Why show up after the blood has been spilled?" "Because the game is over, Arthur," Cora said, stepping toward the desk. She reached into her coat and pulled out a final letter, the paper yellowed and smelling faintly of Eleanor's jasmine. "My mother left this for me to give to you only when Julian finally broke. She knew he would. She knew the sterling name would eventually poison him. She wanted me to be here to pick up the pieces not of the estate but of the man." I took the letter with trembling hands. It was Eleanor's handwriting, elegant and precise. "Arthur," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the house is quiet and the wolves are gone. I am sorry for the lie, but I couldn't let my daughter grow up in a fortress. I couldn't let her become a risk to be mitigated. Julian was a choice I made for you. Cora was a choice I made for her. Please, for once, choose the person over the legacy." The silence in the library was absolute. I looked at Cora, and for the first time in 40 years, I didn't see an heir. I didn't see a successor. I saw a woman who had lived a full, honest life without a single penny of my money or a single drop of my blood-soaked influence. She was a teacher in a small town. She had a family of her own. She was everything I wasn't. "I don't want the money, Arthur," Cora said, her voice steady. "And I don't want the house. I want you to close the book. I want you to stop being the lead investigator and just be a man who finally tells the truth." 3 days later, I drove to the county jail. The fluorescent lights were humming, a sterile, buzzing sound that made the air feel thin. I sat behind the glass partition and waited. When Julian was let in, he looked like he had been hollowed out. His bespoke suit had been replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit. His hair was greasy, his skin a sallow, prison gray. He picked up the phone, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the father he thought he had. "Dad," he whispered. "The lawyers, they say it's bad. Sloan is talking. She's trying to pin the whole thing on me. You have to help me. You paid the debt, you can pay the bail." I looked at him, and for the first time, the anger was gone. There was no fury left, only a profound, echoing pity. He was a victim of a grand design he never understood. He had tried to be a sterling because he thought it was his birthright, never knowing he was just a placeholder in a game of shadows. "Julian," I said, my voice calm, "I'm not here to pay the bail, and I'm not here to fix the case." "What? Why?" He pressed his hand against the glass. "I'm your son." "No," I said softly. "You aren't. And I think deep down you always knew you didn't fit in this skin. You aren't a sterling, Julian. You're just a man who tried to steal a shadow." I told him the truth, all of it. I told him about Eleanor's secret, about Cora, and about the DNA report. I watched his face go through a dozen different deaths as the reality set in. He wasn't a fallen prince. He was a common thief who had broken his own heart for a crown made of paper. "Then what am I?" he sobbed, the sound distorted by the phone line. "If I'm not your son, who am I?" "You're whoever you decide to be once you finish your sentence," I said. "The sterling accounts are settled. The restitution is paid. You'll serve your time. And when you get out, you'll have nothing, no house, no name, no legacy." For the first time in your life, Julian, you'll be free to be an honest man. That's the only gift I have left to give you." I hung up the phone and walked out, ignoring his screams. I didn't look back. The final act of the Sterling legacy didn't happen in a courtroom or a bank. It happened on the front lawn of the manor. I stood with Silas Vane and Cora as the last of the moving trucks pulled away. I hadn't sold the house. I had donated it. The Sterling estate was to become the Eleanor Sterling Sanctuary, a high-security refuge for women and children escaping domestic violence. The 40,000 square foot fortress would finally be a home for people who actually needed protection. I watched Silas toss his keys to the new facility manager. Silas was moving to a ranch in Montana, a place where the only risks were the weather and the wolves. He looked at me, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "What about you, Arthur?" Silas asked. "Where does the legend go now?" I looked at Cora, who was waiting for me by her modest sedan. She had offered me a room in her guest house in Vermont, not because I was a millionaire, and not because I was her father, but because she saw a tired old man who needed to learn how to live without a mission. "I'm going to learn how to grow something that doesn't need to be guarded," I said. I took one last look at the manor. The bandage on my cheek was gone, replaced by a thin, silvery scar. It was a mark of the night I lost everything and finally found what mattered. I had spent my life as a risk consultant, believing that if you controlled the variables, you could control the outcome. But life isn't a spreadsheet. You can't mitigate the human heart, and you can't insure against the truth. As I got into the passenger seat of Cora's car, I realized that my real legacy wasn't the stone walls or the millions in the trust. It was the fact that for the first time in 74 years, I wasn't looking for a threat. I was just looking at the road ahead. The gates of the estate closed behind us for the last time. The Sterling name was gone, dissolved into a charity and a few prison records. But as we drove toward the green mountains of Vermont, the air felt lighter than it had in decades. I wasn't a titan, and I wasn't a legend. I was just Arthur, a man with a daughter, a scar, and a second chance. And in the end, that was the only victory that was ever worth the price of the glass. Respect is earned, but peace? Peace is a choice you make when you finally stop fighting the ghosts of who you think you're supposed to be. I'm 74 years old, and for the first time in my life, the investigation is finally closed. What would you do if you found out your whole life was built on a protective lie? Would you hold on to the anger, or would you walk toward the light? Let me know in the comments. And remember, the most important thing you can ever mitigate is your own regret. Safe travels.